Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Essential NFL Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Clinton, and today we are going to be continuing our process of running through this State of the Team series. Looking at today, we'll be looking at the Washington Commanders, the Cleveland Browns, the New York Giants, and the New Orleans Saints. So, yeah, for those of you not familiar with the podcast newsletter and the series, this is the start of my process to get ready for the 2026 NFL season. So, running through all the different rosters, seeing how all the dust settled now that we've got free agency and the draft in the books, and also taking a little bit of a longer term outlook at some of these teams. So all this will help me get prepped and ready to model these NFL teams once we get into that part of the summer here. So yeah, some modeling coming down the pipe and projections and all that jazz. But right now we're just taking kind of a big picture look at teams and doing some film evaluation, takeaways. So yeah, let's hop right into it. Oh, and I should mention, first episode as this is up. Unfortunately, technical issues caused it to be in two parts, but have the first team, four teams that we're covering in the series, and you can also read about all these teams over at the Essential NFL Substack, which is where I do the written versions of these articles. So, yeah, let's get into it. So kick things off with the Washington Commanders here. So, yeah, as we are entering 2026, the outlook in Washington, I would say this first part is not great. They have $50 million in cap space for the 2026 season. They've got over $100 million in cap space for the 2027 season and $265 million for the 2028 season. And the reason I would say that is, as a quick aside, you got Jaden Daniels on his rookie contract, and we're going to talk about this more, but you should be pushing here. They have $50 million in cap space that they weren't able to spend this year, which is, I wouldn't think that's ideal. Moving on to their draft picks, Washington does have their draft classes fully loaded for 2027, 2028, which is another thing we'll talk about a bit more, but definitely a nice change from where they've been, after some of the moves that they made trying to load up around Daniels. But yeah, we'll keep moving along here. So, football decision makers are Adam Peters is the general manager, Dan Quinn is the head coach. David Blau comes over from the Detroit Lions, former backup quarterback. Who is very highly regarded for his prospects as an OC, and then Durante Jones comes over from the Minnesota Vikings staff. He'll be pairing up with Dan Quinn to coordinate the defense, and then Larry Izos, the special teams coordinator. So, yeah, state of the team. We're entering year three of the Jaden Daniels era now. And my biggest takeaway, I guess, about this pairing of Adam Peters and Dan Quinn as the general manager and the head coach. They've been tied at the hip to Jaden Daniels. Drafted him in their first draft with the second overall pick. They're extremely fortunate that they were able to take Jaden Daniels because outside of that, I'm not really sure what positives there are to point to in Washington right now. And it's such a bummer because let's just start with Jaden Daniels. I love watching Jaden Daniels play. When he's at his best and when he was like really humming in the playoffs his rookie year, I felt like his combination of just explosive traits as an athlete, just elite traits, and his ability to slow the game down mentally and process when there's pressure coming at him, when he has to extend the play. His fourth downs were just absolutely phenomenal. I just think it's a really impressive skill set. And, not to say he was a completely finished product as a rookie or there weren't areas that he could improve in because, that no quarterback in the NFL that's true for. But, everything was super positive with Jaden Daniels. And, I think he's a phenomenally talented guy. The injury concerns are a concern, right? He wasn't able to stay on the field this year, and that was one knock on him coming out of college was just with the narrow frame and the way he played. Would he be able to hold up? So we know he's not invincible, but if he's on the field, I expect Jaden Daniels to play at a really high level. The problem is they haven't put a very good team around him. This defense has been just terrible the past 2 years. And the skill position players, with the exception of Terry McLaurin 2 years ago, and I didn't think Terry was, as impressive last year. They just don't really have any high end skill players, and so you're kind of looking at this roster, and it's like, all right, so we've got some good players along the offensive line here, but what are we doing with the rest of this roster? So let's zoom in on some of those pieces. So on the offense. Yeah, we've got Terry McLaurin coming back, and then just kind of a dearth of talent behind him. I think it's fair to say. We'll see how they integrate these guys. But, when we look at the depth chart, Debo Samuel, who led the team in receiving, he's not even on there. Totally possible they bring him back at, a lower cap number after, trading fifth round pick for Debo and, getting the 1 year of production out of him. But, I don't think that's a certainty. I don't think that Debo is, aging steadily. I think that he's continuing to, drop off, and it's very unlikely you're going to see him return to his, elite form at this point. So I don't know how much help you're getting there. You draft Antonio Williams as a receiver in the third round, and you add Chigo Okonkwo in free agency, along with bringing Diami Brown back, who, he busted out in Jacksonville after flashing a little bit, but he wasn't a huge part of the Washington offense. Rewinding to Chigo Okonkwo, the tight end from Tennessee. I mean, he's got some explosive traits to him, but he's not a people mover. He's a very specific type of tight end, and he hasn't averaged more than 10 yards a catch since his rookie season. And then you're throwing in a third rounder there. I mean, some of the other names here, we got, Luke McCaffrey, who has failed to distinguish himself, Jalen Lane, who I think might be their top returning pass catcher. I was looking at that with 16 catches last year because, it's Zach Ertz, tore his ACL late in the year and, had racked up a lot of production. So he's unlikely to walk back through the door at his age coming off a major injury. And then, Treylon Burks is Treylon Burks. He's, never really latched on in the NFL, and that seems really unlikely at this point. I think you can say, better things about the offensive line for sure. I would say that, among all these trades, and I'll address kind of the totality of these trades for veterans in the wrap up here. The Tunzel trade certainly seems to have worked out the best. Did miss some time down the stretch last year, but I thought Tunzel played at a high level when he was out there. So at least you've got a really strong blindside protector moving forward. And I like the pairing of him with Josh Connerly on the opposite bookend. Connerly, like a lot of rookie players, could stand to become more consistent, just continue to refine his game. I think he has some good film, but down the stretch you throw on that film against Abdul Carter from the Giants, and granted, Carter gives a lot of guys issues with his quickness and agility. But at the same time, that is, not ideal film for Josh Connerly in terms of, being an elite player in this league, which is, at least a plus elite player is what you'd love to get with your first round picks. The biggest positive I would say is that Sam Cosmi is a full year removed from the season ending torn ACL, if I've got that right, from 2 years ago, and, was playing, a pretty good ball down the stretch. And I think that, with a full offseason to train, that's a huge positive to be able to say that Sam Cosmi should be at full speed. And the other guard spot with Chris Paul, I thought Chris Paul did, a solid job winning the job last year, and that he's, going to be a competent starter for them moving forward. But then again, don't see him, pushing for all pro honors or being a field tilter. Where we start to get to where this is really starting to go sideways for me. Nick Allegretti is set to be the starting center there. And, they drafted Matt Golban in the 6th round here. And, we'll see how this all goes. Cutting Tyler Biadasz when you've got all this money that you can't find players to spend it on, and only to have him sign a contract immediately with the Chargers. He was drawing interest from other teams around the league. That doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, it's as I'm going through all these roster transactions and all these moves, like you see certain things, and it's like, what happened there? And like, this is kind of an all timer. I don't understand what Tyler Biadasz could have done that caused Washington to feel like they just wanted to cut him. When, let's just set aside my opinion of Biadasz. I think he is a solid center who's got quite a bit of good tape throughout his time in the league. It doesn't matter what I think. The league thinks that he's a offensive lineman worth paying, $10 million a year. And the Chargers weren't apparently the only team interested in doing that. And it happened immediately. It's not like he lingered on the market and, people wanted to wait it out. So, it'd be one thing if you had any sort of a plan to replace him, but they clearly didn't. Now they're stuck with Nick Allegretti, who is a journeyman guard who has never played at the level that Biadasz has, slated as the starting center. You got a dice roll on a 6th round prospect. And I mean, it's just, how do you justify that? Like it just doesn't make any sense. Like the Commanders knew that they were coming into this draft with holes in their draft from the Tunsil trade, among other things. And yeah, I don't understand how you're cutting solid players and letting them walk out the door when you're not in a cap crunch. The Commanders have had the opposite problem for the past 2 years. They have no good players on this roster to pay. I mean, it's obviously a little bit of hyperbole there because you got guys like Sam Cosmi, and obviously Terry McLaurin got his contract extension. But going back to that contract impasse, this is the same discussion. Like, if you're not going to give Terry McLaurin a little extra money, where do you think you're going to spend the $50 million this year, the $100 million next year? You don't have anybody to pay on your roster until you do Jaden Daniels' contract. And that's still, we're going into, man, year 3 now. So you can't even negotiate the extension. And then you got 100 million the year after, and then 250. So that's not a concern. So now we're looking at this roster here, and the running back situation seems to be another one that they just kind of handled in a bizarre way, with their eagerness to get Brian Robinson out of the building because they were so amped up about Bill Crosby Merritt. And look, Bill, or Ja'Cory Crosby Merritt, nickname Bill, whatever you like, who's a fine back, right? Like, he's a fine rotational back. He doesn't add anything as a pass catcher. I don't know. It's not like they threw, Saquon Barkley or Bijan Robinson out there, or, had found like Arian Foster at the back of the draft and had anything like that. So I don't know. Brian Robinson to me still had, some solid run for the 49ers there. And I get similar in that both of these guys are just runners, inside the tackle runners. But again, like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we just, so in any case, they add Rachaad White at running back. So like, just very little juice out of the backfield. Rachaad White will be the pass catching back and probably the pass protector, given just sheer volume numbers on how many balls these guys have caught. But I don't see Rachaad White as like a dynamic player in the passing game. So, and then we get to the offensive coordinator change, and it's great that they're bringing in David Blau and that so many people around the league are excited about this guy. But I thought Cliff Kingsbury did a pretty good job Jaden Daniels' rookie year in terms of making this offense go. I didn't think that they made it go in year 1, despite Cliff Kingsbury. To the contrary, I would say that the Cliff Kingsbury and Jaden Daniels, relationship worked pretty well for Jaden Daniels' skill set and, figuring out a way to scheme this offense up. So, I think we're in a situation where even if David Blau is a good first year coordinator, I don't know that he's really going to maximize the talent or lack thereof any better than Cliff Kingsbury did. Let's just call it 2 years ago and not discuss last year. And I don't know. I just don't fully see where this is going. As I say, I like pieces along the offensive line. I love Jaden Daniels on it, when he's working, and Terry McLaurin has been, a receiver I've really enjoyed watching. I mean, shoot, since what was it, that Philadelphia game in week 1 where you got, third rounder from Ohio State just popping off in that crazy ass game. Terry McLaurin's getting, to an older age, and, rather than improving the supporting cast around them, I mean, they've gotten worse with the supporting cast around him with Zach Ertz going down, because he's been really, kind of the only other consistent hit for this offense. So yeah, I mean, it just is, it's not a very good group. And then we're flipping over to the defense here, and there's a lot of names changing on this defense. I'm really wondering if anything outside of adding Sonny Styles with the 7th overall pick, and just to let's get positive here. Let's get Sonny about Sonny. Although I love that he's named after Sonny Corleone, so that's a better probably the demeanor you want to be brought with a nickname of Sonny rather than bright sunny sunshine. But yeah, so we're throwing Sonny Styles, and they're basically swapping him out for Bobby Wagner. And yeah, for sure, Sonny Styles is going to have way more athleticism than Bobby Wagner was bringing to the table at this stage in his career. I mean, the dude tested through the roof, and I can't wait to watch this guy play. I love inside linebackers, and having a guy with this athleticism and this profile, I'm just so hopeful that he hits in the league, because if he does, I'm gonna just absolutely adore watching this guy for the rest of his career. But it's a hell of an ask for a rookie linebacker to come in here and this defense, in my estimation, has been horrible for the past 2 years, and we're just going to ask Sonny Styles to fix it. And okay, yeah, we did a few other moves, right? Like they bring in Tim Settle in free agency. I think Settle's quietly had very good film in Houston in the past 2 years here. He's got some really good reps, but I'd say Houston's defensive tackles, we've seen a lot of guys go in there and play the best ball of their career under D'Amico Ryans and his crew, and in some cases move on and not have it work out. So I'm more inclined to think that anybody showing up in Houston is likely to get a boost rather than I am that Settle's necessarily gonna, maybe he sustains it, but I don't think he's gonna take it to another level. You add Odafe Owe and Caleb Von Chasen as your edge rushers. I mean, this team cannot stop the run for their life. Watching teams are just happy to run it down their throat. They play with kind of this light look, and now we're throwing Chase on and Odafe Owe, who would both be described as finesse rushers out there as our edges. So I guess the one thing to battle against that is adding Leo Chenal as a potential weak side linebacker. Whether or not that takes Frankie Louvu out of the lineup, and very, very different players with Chenal, who's much more of a run fitter. He can get up on the line, use his size. Louvu is more of a blitzer. Brings his destruction that way. With he can do a lot as kind of a movement attack piece at off ball linebacker, but is not necessarily a read it out and fit guy. So I don't know. Chenal might help a little bit, but they didn't really, make any needle moving moves along the defensive line. Javon Kinlaw's a rotational player. I'd say Daron Payne. I mean, he was a plus borderline elite player, certainly elite on his best days in my book, several years ago. But I think he's just kind of lost a little bit of his juice. And then, you can look at the back end here, and you bring in Nick Cross at safety. I don't really know that Nick Cross is like clearly better than what you're getting from whether it's Will Harris or Quan Martin. I mean, I think that Nick Cross to me is a guy who isn't going to hurt you out there, but he's not a field tilter in my estimation. And then I don't know between Mike Sandersstill and Amik Robertson who is going to play in the slot and who's going to play outside across from Trey Amos in the nickel, but our proposition here, bringing in Amik Robertson, is that if he and Sandersstill are on the field together, we're going to put two 5'9", 180-pound corners on the field in an NFL where every team that didn't like their 12 personnel last year drafted a tight end in the middle of the draft so they can go bigger. So, that's like the zigging in the wrong direction when the rest of the league is zagging. I don't understand how this personnel fits today's NFL at all. Like, it's just this very light group on the edges, and we're okay with the 3 down linemen, but I mean, being that small at corner, in addition to not having bulk on the edges, it just doesn't make sense to me. And, maybe they're going to, totally overhaul it, try to run the Brian Flores stuff from Minnesota with Durante Jones coming in. I'm skeptical that he'll have that much influence, but even if you did, I just don't know if you've got the players that you need to pull that off. So, it's just kind of amazing, again, to, be able to draft a player as good as Jaden Daniels with the second overall pick and to find yourself in this position. But I'd say, a big part of it is that, there were limited avenues to pursue roster upgrades, and they, traded so many kind of, second, third round picks, and the fifth for Debo in the Marshawn Lattimore trade and the Laramie Tunzel trade, and then picking up Debo and looking at Debo and swapping a fifth. Well, in a vacuum, who cares, right? Like, that's fine. You've got this cap space. Like, it didn't hurt them to pay Debo Samuel's contract last year, but when you add it to all the other picks they've shipped out, they've just been working with some pretty lean drafts the past couple of years. And they took, I think it's 6 guys in the top 100 in the Jaden Daniels draft, but Jaden Daniels is the only difference maker out of that group. Like, Sandersstill is I think a fine corner, but he's just not that big. He's certainly not a dominant player. And then Jershawn Newton, Johnny Newton, who they took at the back into the first round or early in the second. I might be off on that. After Daniels, I mean, he's just a fine player. And then you got guys who just aren't contributing from that class. So it's crazy to say this about this Washington team, but like, they're in kind of a distressed asset position almost from my perspective, where at least they'll have the picks moving forward. But like, you made one premium pick in this draft on Sonny Styles. That's all you could add to the defense. And then you're adding a third round receiver, which, that's a nice dice roll to take. But man, we got no fourth round pick, if I'm not mistaken here. Just looking at the RLAD step chart to make sure I'm not missing anything. But yeah, you know, adding fifth, sixth rounders to a roster that was not good last year. And then, just bulk buying on a free agency market where teams aren't letting good players get out the door is just, I'm not saying they had good options, and that's obviously what leads to some of these trades, but like to swing and miss that bad on Marshawn Lattimore, who you acquire him when he is injured, and I don't know if he ever played a good snap for Washington. I mean, he was just bad down the stretch last year, and then obviously, this year didn't go well either. So we'll see. It's crazy though. I remember, you can go back, look at my write up on the Commanders from last offseason, and it was shocking after the run they'd been on to really kind of go through the bones of the roster and the assets they had and say, well, yeah, I don't know. Like, they obviously won games, but I don't see how this team is really going to push from where they finished in the regular season, sneaking into the playoffs. And, with some fortunate luck, some Tyreek Stevenson help in that Chicago Hail Mary game. I don't see how they're going to push this team. And then it, went the other way, totally unraveled. And, I don't know. I think it's, a likely team where we're seeing everybody get fired at the end of the year. And, this is going to be a really attractive job if Jaden Daniels has a healthy season because of his presence. But man, I just don't really see how this roster is gonna make it in this year's NFC. So I guess a little bit of a downer on these teams, but hey, is what it is. You call them like you see them, and it's just not a very good roster in Washington right now. So we'll see how it goes moving forward, but they just have really not maximized that situation very well at all. So we'll see how. Yeah. Anyways, let's keep moving along, and here's a team that I am more excited about the roster. And man, if we could put Jaden Daniels on this roster, I mean, now we're cooking. We got a stew going, right? So I'm talking about the Cleveland Browns here. So yeah, the Cleveland Browns entering 2026. They've kind of navigated past this Deshaun Watson cap morass. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But Browns have $25 million in cap space this year, $82 million next year, and then $250 million in 2028. We're kind of cleared books and cleared decks, everything like that. And shout out to Spot Rack, by the way, all these numbers are coming off their site. And then in terms of the draft, they largely have full drafts. The Browns have their picks in rounds 1 through 5. They've got an extra 5 from Houston, and then their own 7, and then or Houston's 5 and 7, I think that is, and then next year they've got their 1 through 6. At the football decision maker positions, Andrew Berry continues as the general manager here, bringing Todd Monken as the head coach with Travis Switzer as his offensive coordinator. Switzer had been run game coordinator in Baltimore when Monken arrived, and then went with Monken to Cleveland here. Mike Rudenberg, a longtime guy in the NFL, who was actually Joe Gibbs's assistant in Washington back in, I think, 2003, and has done a lot in the league, starting in personnel and then working his way through the coaching ranks. He'll be the defensive coordinator, and then Brian Storer is the special teams coordinator. So looking at kind of the state of the Browns, I think we can officially say with them, totally turning the offensive line over and everything like that, that this championship window, and I do think that while they came nowhere near to getting in the window, there was a championship window in Cleveland. I think that has closed, but they've definitely got the pieces to open up another one here moving forward. And to that point, just to kind of look back at that version of the Cleveland Browns that the trade for Deshaun Watson completely destroyed. I mean, that was a really, really good team. That offensive line was solid across the board with standouts in Joel Bitonio. And when Wyatt Teller was at his best, I mean, he was just a people mover out there in the run game. Nick Chubb was unbelievable. I mean, before his knee injury, the dude was elite every year of his career. He'll go down as one of the best running backs I ever watched. And it was a total pleasure watching Nick Chubb dominate. I mean, just, to quickly describe him, I felt like he was an unbelievably efficient runner in terms of his path. Just, there was so little fat on the pass that he took. He wasn't like bouncing things unnecessarily. And then he just had that strength to get through tackles and the explosiveness to take it to the house. And I mean, looking at his draft classmate, Saquon Barkley, that was especially early on the big difference is Saquon was always kind of big play hunting and looking to bounce things. And he was successful doing that, something that not, looking at it as a hard knock or anything, but Chubb was just so efficient, and it was just a pleasure to watch. And had the piece around him. The defense was balling with your cornerstone pieces, Miles Garrett and Denzel Ward, who are still there, and they were just so well rounded. But kind of it's on to the next thing, right? Because you need a quarterback to make it all go, and that was not Deshaun Watson. So I think that as they reset here, I think you get a really good head coaching hire. Potentially in Todd Monken. And obviously a lot more to the head coaching job than running the offense. But from a schematic standpoint, I mean, I've enjoyed what Todd Monken brings to the table, dating back to when he was running that Bucs offense with Ryan Fitzpatrick and Jameis Winston, and they were just bombing that ball all over the yard and no run game. Defense not very good, but man, what Deshaun Jackson, and I guess that would have been early Mike Evans or earlier Mike Evans. I mean, that was a fun pairing to watch for sure. And then, goes on to Georgia, successful at the college level, comes back to the NFL. And I thought that last year aside, the offense he put together with Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry 2 years ago, especially as they kind of found their rhythm and, once they were really emphasizing the physicality and the downhill running game and everything they could do off of that. I mean, that Ravens team in 12 personnel or 22 personnel under center with Henry in the backfield and two tight ends who are pass catching threats and capable enough blockers. The ability to boot Lamar, I mean, it was just so hard to defend, and I think that they really found a lot there. It was disappointing it didn't continue into last year, but I mean, for my money, that Ravens offense under Todd Monken is as good an offense as I'll ever watch. They were outstanding, even if they didn't get the success they wanted in the postseason. So, I think that really strong hire there with Todd Monken, and we'll talk about the Giants in a minute here. But I'd feel way different about the Giants if Todd Monken was still with John Harbaugh than with Matt Nagy being there. So, what's Todd Monken going to be working with here? I think that at the quarterback position, that's going to be a big thing in Cleveland this year. We got two very famous names in Deshaun Watson and Shedeur Sanders. Let's try to touch on them both briefly. If you've ever listened to my stuff before, you'll have heard me talk about Deshaun before. When he was in Houston, dude was just elite. I'd say, his acclimation to the NFL, I don't think I've ever seen somebody acclimate to processing the NFL passing game faster than Deshaun Watson did. I mean, go back his first win. I mean, he was running the ball against Cincinnati for the win. And then, I mean, week 2, remember getting frustrated with him not seeing a certain concept and coming back the next drive, hitting the route he should have hit. I mean, and then it just took off. I thought that he was an unbelievable player who could basically do anything you wanted as a quarterback. He could kill you from the pocket. And he had great mobility and creativity as a runner. The guy who showed up in Cleveland just was never the same. Just don't think he could do it mentally anymore. He saw flashes of the physical before he started getting hurt. You'd see him run, and it's like, I think he's got similar athleticism. You'd see him line up his throws. Like, all right, that one looked pretty good. But he's never injured, but he just doesn't mentally process things anymore. And, for all the talk about, it's the scheme this or Stefanski's scheme or Ken Dorsey's scheme or what he ran in Houston. I mean, the guy can't execute stick. The guy can't execute a basic rollout. He can't execute four verts. So if you can't execute any of the basic plays within different schemes that really overlap across all schemes, I'll understand how you're supposed to build any scheme when the quarterback can't execute any plays. So I don't know, maybe Watson somehow got his, brain rewired while he was recovering from 2 torn Achilles. That seems really unlikely to me. But yeah, I mean, it was like the anti-Peyton Manning, where Peyton Manning showed up in Denver. The guy could barely throw a spiral, but there was no doubt in my mind he still knew how to play quarterback in the NFL. He knew exactly what he was seeing. He knew exactly where he wanted the ball to go. Watson was not injured, and he went through a lot as a human being, and certainly not saying that in defending the guy stance. He just did go through a lot, and doesn't seem to see the field at all anymore. And I would be absolutely shocked if that changes with him coming back from the injury here. That would just, that would be something. guess we'll deal with that if it comes. Shador Sanders, I think he's got a decent physical skill set. Definitely has some nice deep balls on his film. I think that he could be a bottom end starter based on that physical skill set. I think Mac Jones, I think, would be a really good best case scenario for him. But Shador Sanders, first off, he needs to be a timing and rhythm passer, and he plays with very poor timing and rhythm. I'll expand on that because I think it's actually the bigger point here. And then on top of that, he makes an astonishing number of just horrible, horrible decisions that are like Will Levis level lose you the game on one play decisions. And I don't understand why he thinks he can make those plays. At least Levis has a monster arm to somehow, give you the idea you can, well, not that that's going to help you pitching the ball out to the flat, but we don't need to talk about Will Levis right now. Shador has very limited physical gifts at the NFL level, and he plays like he thinks he can do anything on the field, and frankly, things that nobody does. So maybe coaching gets that part out of it. But what's more concerning to me is, again, this guy needs to be a timing and rhythm passer, and he just doesn't see it very well. A lot of reps there where you've got an open receiver on, that should be the first look in the concept. And, if film evaluation isn't enough to tell you that there's some frustration going on, a lot of their body language, especially Jerry Jeudy in some cases, is letting you know that, hey, like, what are we doing here? I'm supposed to, he clearly thinks he's supposed to be getting the ball. He is indisputably open, and Shador's just kind of on his own thing. He's pretty quick to get down to the scramble and everything. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. I think that Shador's got a very long potential career in the NFL as potentially a high-end backup, like low-end spot starter, if he, figures out how to play with timing and rhythm and maximizes his gifts. But, that wasn't happening last year. So we'll see if it's better under Malkin. I don't think that either one of these guys is going to be good enough. And I think that as a result, the team's going to lose a lot of games and be in position to find their quarterback next offseason. And we'll see with that. But there's a chance that quarterback will get, a really good group around him. Now, nothing is certain about the offense that Andrew Berry has built out here with Todd Monken this offseason, but I think it's an exciting mystery box to open, right? If we talk about the Cleveland Browns here, let's start with the skill position players. And, hopefully Quinshon Judkins comes back strong from that broken leg, because he was freaking outstanding last year for the Browns. I mean, looking like a draft steal, just with the combination of his physicality and his long speed. I mean, he's a really, really impressive player. Really like watching Judkins run for sure. And then, in terms of the skill position players around him, Harold Fannin, I've heard I think Harold Fannin is like a really, really solid piece. I've heard it said that he might go in the first round in a redraft. I'm not entirely sure about that, just given the skill set as kind of an undersized tight end who's, I don't feel like, going to bring a ton to you as a, certainly not set up to be a strong inline blocker in the NFL. But that said, I think he's, really consistent pass catcher with, good speed, a very solid player in that role in the NFL. Some games were certainly like some of the longer things. He's catching the ball in just open space and finding grass rather than being totally dynamic. But just noting that, like, I don't see like him being an elite player in that role. Like, I don't see, him becoming the peak version of Travis Kelce or anything like that. Maybe that goes without saying for everybody out there. But when people start throwing out the first round pick, then I think it gets a little bit distorted. But like Harold Fannin, guy, sign him up all day. Every single offense in the NFL would love to have that guy. And then around him, we have Jerry Jeudy in place, and Jeudy is an inconsistent player, but hey, like, I think the guy is a pretty good NFL, or a good NFL receiver, all things considered. Like, he certainly has his days and can get behind defenses and has some speed. So I really like the players that they drafted to complement him with. You got KC Concepcion in the first round, who everybody described as this super dynamic player. He can be in the slot, he can be out wide, had some problems with drops in college, but hey, people drop the ball, that can be improved on. And, you can't teach the type of speed and explosiveness that KC Concepcion is going to bring to the table. And then they get a big body in Denzel Boston, who, a lot of draft analysts say like his ability to, be your X receiver and, maybe not be Mike Evans in terms of his ability to take the top off the defense, but definitely be somebody who can get open as a bigger bodied X receiver, not just somebody who's going to be, creating zero separation. So, if that all plays out, I mean, you're talking about a really well rounded, diverse group of pass catchers. And then just, every mix of explosive players, physical players, just across the board. So I think that's really, really exciting. And then on the offensive line, we'll see how this whole reshuffle goes. I think that, good bringing Zion Johnson at left guard, Elton Jenkins at center, Titus Howard set to play right tackle. Certainly questions with each of those players. Zion Johnson, I don't think came anywhere close to maxing out the draft profile as a first round pick. Otherwise, he'd still be in Los Angeles, but he definitely has his moments in the run game and could slot him well, play good here. Elton Jenkins, coming off injury and kind of an acrimonious end to his time in Green Bay, but not going to be the elite player he was before he had his first major knee injury. But at the same time, I think he can be a really solid player for you. And then Titus Howard, versatile player, and has done a good job in this league. So we'll see. The big piece is, of course, Spencer Fano. Need him to come along at left tackle, and he's the building block on that offensive line. Whereas, the rest of these guys, adding these veterans, have to have Jenkins still in house. You'll kind of see how that sorts itself out. But Austin Barber, the third round pick, I'm sure nobody in Cleveland would be complaining if that dude plays his way into the lineup on that offensive line and gives them some longer term setup. So, as I say, I think this offense, like the infrastructure is really, really promising. Maybe the offensive line doesn't have the talent necessarily to be a top 10 unit, but like for sure could be a very solid unit in kind of the middle of the league. And then look to keep adding to that. If you get your left tackle, you can find some plus players at the guard and center position at, without premium picks. So who knows where it goes, in the coming year for Cleveland. And this is certainly a multi-year outlook on this build. So flipping over to the defense, I think the defense could be damn good right now. I think that, it's going to be interesting seeing, kind of the what shifts, if any, are made with, new defensive coordinator in Mike Rudenberg here. Rudenberg, he's been around the league so much that a lot of different influences, but where he really got going as a defensive coordinator is what he was on the San Francisco staff, and then he went or on track to become a defensive coordinator, I should say. He left San Francisco with Robert Saleh to take a prominent role on Saleh's staff in New York, working with the defense, and then he stuck with Brett Brick Ulbrich. Yeah, I call him Brick. Ulbrich. I think Jeff Ulbrich, I think. Yeah, sorry, the name Brick's messing me up there. But Ulbrich, when he went down to be the DC for Atlanta, you had Rudenberg go with him, so he had another opportunity there. So I'm thinking, probably kind of that San Francisco feel, the Saleh stuff is probably going to be pretty prominent, which lines up very well with some dude named Myles Garrett who plays for the Cleveland Browns and is, made in a lab to play, with his hand in the dirt as a defensive end, as a wide nine in the, departed Jim Schwartz's departed defensive coordinator Jim Schwartz's scheme. I mean, Myles is, not that Myles wouldn't fit anywhere, but Garrett is like literally what you would, the exact spec you would put together there. So he led, set the NFL single season sack record last year on an offense on a team that very rarely had a positive point differential. So I think he's still got a little bit left in the tank there with Myles Garrett well on his way to the Hall of Fame. And I'm really excited about the defense they'll be building around him again. I think Denzel Ward is still a very steady player at outside cornerback when he's healthy. Smaller guy, so he gets dinged from time to time, but when he's out there, Denzel Ward tends to ball. I am still perplexed by why the Jaguars traded Tyson Campbell, who had term left on his deal at a good number for Tyson Campbell. Good number for Tyson Campbell before the cap started going through the roof, since he signed his deal, and especially afterwards. And you get Greg Newsome back, who I don't know if Greg Newsome on his best day was, as good as what Tyson Campbell put out on a pretty consistent basis. And Newsome's deal was up at the end of the year. So that was just weird. It worked out well for the Browns, in my opinion. I thought Campbell played, had some good plays on the film I've evaluated with him rocking number 7 for the Cleveland Browns. And I think that get a really good outside corner duo with him and Denzel Ward heading into next year, and then we'll see how they build it out around them. What I'm really excited about is throwing Quincy Williams at linebacker next to Carson Schweissinger. Uh, really enjoyed what Schweissinger did as a rookie. Defensive Rookie of the Year, if I recall correctly. I don't know exactly on that. I'm not so great on some of the postseason awards off the top of my head, but I believe he won that, and certainly would have been well deserved if he did. Schweissinger is a really good read it out linebacker, right? He can see it all from the inside linebacker position and just understands where to go. Has great instincts, and that's critical. With a guy like Quincy Williams, who at his very best, it was when he was playing next to CJ Mosley with the Jets. And, Mosley's able to handle kind of that more cerebral linebacker role. And then Quincy Williams, dude can run and dude can hit. That's been clear on his tape since he was playing in Jacksonville. Still just an all-timer. That Urban Meyer just cut him for nothing. And then he goes on to be an all-pro with the New York Jets, playing behind his brother in Rob Saleh's defense. And, Quincy Williams certainly had a down year last year. For some reason, that happened to a bunch of guys on the Jets. Like, who knows what happens, right? His brother gets traded midseason, and then, he loses his role. But I don't know that means that Quincy Williams doesn't have any good football left in him in his career. I think there's a very real chance that he bounces back this year playing in this Cleveland defense. And then, kind of looking at the pieces filling in around, it's going to be interesting to see what they do from a personnel standpoint. I don't know that they would have expected Emmanuel McNeil-Warren to drop to them in the second round, but or do you have Grant Delpit in house, who's a guy that I just developed into a player I very much like at safety. Some early career struggles, but I think that Delpit can do just kind of all sorts of things for you as a safety and do it at a fairly high level. Good player there. And then you got Ronnie Hickman there too. So we could see a lot of big nickel in Cleveland this year. If we don't, I guess that, out of nickelback, you got guys like Miles Harden, Miles Bryant kind of listed on the depth chart, which would be the other reason that we might see, more of a lean towards some big nickel. I think that Delpit can definitely get down there and play that role for you if McNeil-Warren is kind of more of a back half player, which, some analysts said, but we'll kind of see where that goes. But yeah, all things considered, I think it's a really interesting group to watch. How Mason Graham develops this year, and if he can add some, more pass rush on the interior, I think will go a long way in how the group around Myles Garrett plays along that line. But at the same time, bringing in hopefully Malik Collins, continue to add something on that interior. Have Alex Wright as the other end. Like, he's a solid enough player. Like, these aren't superstars for sure, and that would be the big knock on this Cleveland defense, is like there isn't a really clear secondary or even third pass rusher behind Myles Garrett, but Myles Garrett's going to do a whole lot for you. So, we'll see. I think that's a position they could look to add in next year's draft, but certainly not going to disagree with their decision to max out the offense right now. And so all things considered, I think, without a quarterback, probably tough year ahead for the Cleveland Browns. But in terms of like best way to handle this and get this thing reset on a 2-3 year timeline, I think that they knocked it out of the park. I can't disagree with anything they did. So yeah, obviously, besides trading for Deshaun Watson, and then we're well past that. Although, yeah. I guess he'll be on the roster again. What a story that has been. Let's pop forward to the New York Giants here. And yeah, as I mentioned, did not bring Todd Monken along here, but let's talk about the state of the Giants without him. So, entering 2026, the Giants have $16 million in cap space this year. They bumped that up to $87 million next year, and then $275 million 3 years down the road. So nothing that they're super locked into with roster vision. Some wiggle room this year, and then plenty of room to play for next year. They've got their draft classes largely intact. They're missing this the 2027 round pick, but they have 1 through 6 and all the 2028 picks. And then the football decision makers. Joe Shane returns as the general manager. I'll touch on him briefly. Head coach is John Harbaugh. Matt Nagy comes in as the offensive coordinator in an interesting hire. And then defensive coordinator is going to be Denard Wilson, coming over from Tennessee, and special teams will be Chris Horton, who's been with Harbaugh for some time, rocking that special team side. So, I'd say the state of the Giants is, this has been an organization in turmoil, to say the least, right? Like, kind of last offseason, it seemed like the only reason they were retaining the coaching staff with Brian Dable and the GM and Joe Shane was because they didn't want to be the team that fires their coaches every 2 years. But like, if that's the only reason you're not firing him is so you don't, it's that line from The Office, like, or Michael Scott is, has to fire somebody and he decides on this one guy and, he is whole thing, but the guy ends up saying to me, he's like, "That's why I'm being fired, so that you might not look like an idiot." And I mean, perfectly describes the Giant situation in reverse. Like that's why I'm not being fired, so that you might not look like an idiot. I mean, look, man, you look like an idiot on a regular basis running this organization. Not real good at owning an NFL team, it doesn't seem like. So, it's just one of those things where, wait, what a ridiculous reason to keep him around. They wind up firing him by Thanksgiving, so that's a good use of a season. But in any case, yeah, like Giants are moving into this new regime with John Harbaugh stepping in as the head coach. And getting back to Joe Shane, don't think he has done a good job as the general manager of this team at all. And not really impressed with his process that we got back curtain peek into in Hard Knocks. That was quite disheartening. And, the one thing I'll say for him is that I didn't think that George Patton had been necessarily doing the best job in Denver. Sean Payton came into the organization. He became the lead decision maker, and now they assembled a great roster, and George Patton just signed an extension through 2030. I could see that happening with Joe Shane if John Harbaugh comes in and he's able to, set and control the culture of the organization. Maybe this gets turned around for Joe Shane. And, it's not that he's been totally disastrous in the draft or he's gone like way off consensus on anything he's doing, but just some iffy moves, trading Brian Burns with where they were. And, not that Brian Burns isn't a good player, but you're paying him premium money. I just don't think there's been anything great to distinguish Joe Shane. And then there have been moments that were just really, not well handled, whether it was the Daniel Jones contract or the Saquon Barkley contract, which were two pretty important decisions. So anyway, that's a little bit of an eyebrow raiser, but whatever, we'll see how that goes. In terms of the pieces they've got in place on the team, I think the key piece to talk about here is Jackson Dart, who I think you could say is a potential franchise quarterback. But let's just jump into the offense and my evaluations here. So my evaluation on Jackson Dart, it's kind of straightforward and boring at this point. I think he's got a very similar skill set to Bo Nix. I think that if he were in the right structure, the right offense, the right and got himself playing with the right style, that you could see his game, continue to develop. And honestly, he doesn't have any tape that's as bad as Nix's early tape. So I think that he could certainly develop into the guy Nix was down the back half of the season, and really, somebody who's just coming along, has playmaking ability with his legs for sure. Dart might have even more with his legs than Nix brings, and pretty good arm, and able to make a lot of throws, and a lot of good there in the physical skill set. But all that said, watching Jackson Dart's film, I found it to be just immensely frustrating. And, this is always, it's never 100% one way or the other. When, if you go back to me talking about Cam Ward, I'm going to say the opposite, where I feel like Cam Ward didn't have a lot of opportunities. And even though I could see him like going to the right, it's just not there. With Jackson Dart, there are way too many reps where I feel like he kind of comes off his first read and then he's not entirely sure what he's supposed to be looking for. There's one crossing route in particular that comes to mind where he had first receiver running a crosser from the right side of the field, and then it's Darius Slayton's coming across on a lower crosser, and essentially the safety gets put in conflict. He has to get a little bit deeper in the middle of the field, and Slayton's route comes open, and they're running it off some action, and Dart's eyes are just all over the place. He's never really like, I can't really tell. And normally when you're watching NFL quarterbacks, you can see eyes are tied to the feet, and as they're moving across and scanning, you can tell what they're looking at. Not that they're telegraphing it. Sometimes they are, and that leads to bad things. But like, to throw with good mechanics, you have to move your body. You can't just, throw the ball to the left side of the field when you're facing to the right side and like huck it over your shoulder and be particularly successful doing that. There's some freaks that can, trick shot that occasionally, but that's not a way to consistently put the ball where you want it, right? So normally you can see this, and with Dart, it's just, his eyes are often disconnected from his feet. So you'll see him kind of scanning, and you can't quite tell what he's scanning to or why he's making the decisions. It's almost like he kind of randomly looks, and if there's nothing there, he'll kind of look back that way, and then he'll start running. And on the rep I was actually talking about with the two crossers with Sladen, he gets up the middle and runs for an explosive gain. So it turns out to be a fine play, but like that's a hard way to make a living in the NFL. And we'll see where this goes. If Todd Monken was coming in to be his coach, I'd be really, really excited about this. But Matt Nagy did not do a very good job. Well, he wasn't able to develop Mitch Trubisky, who frankly has like a lot of similar tools to Jackson Dart, I think you would say, like in terms of the physical profile and everything. And then when he had Justin Fields, Matt Nagy did like as bad a job as you could have done bringing along a quarterback who has this explosive skill set as a runner and is developing as a passer. I mean, he just threw him out there and asked him to, operate from the pocket. And it's like, well, I don't know, like maybe getting him all these reps, like that's good, but maybe have some success too, and not have the whole thing blow up. So I'm just not very confident in Matt Nagy's ability to put together a good offense for somebody like Jackson Dart, who really relies on his athleticism, his playmaking ability outside of the pocket. Now, Jackson needs to tone that back a little bit and, stop getting himself exposed to these huge hits, because he's just not going to survive in the NFL doing that, because nobody does. But at the same time, like you can't take his legs out of his game, and that should be something that the offense is built around to a certain degree in terms of especially just creating hesitation in the defense and working off of it. And Matt Nagy is like one of the last people I would hire to work with a quarterback like that. So I don't think there's a lot of good to say about that. And, it's just kind of a weird pairing. And, I hope that it works out, because I much prefer watching, good structured offenses and quality play to being frustrated with what I'm seeing on film. And, that's just kind of a team by team thing, year by year. So, and Jackson Dart could for sure be a really exciting player, but we'll just kind of see where that goes. The offense around him, I mean, if Cam Scottaboo is back and he's the dude he was, like similar to Quinshon Judkins, just, really fun player to watch. He's a physical guy. I mean, I thought that, Scottaboo's phone booth quickness really impressed me. Just like really good, quick feet for a man that big. It surprised me quite a bit. Like he's, certainly I wouldn't describe him as a lumberer at that size. And then, we'll kind of see with the group around him. Receiver room totally hinges on whether Malik Neighbors comes back healthy or not. If he is back to his elite self and ultra explosive once again, then you've got an absolute stud to build the room around. I think Darius Slayton and Darnell Mooney in theory complement each other well, as just steady enough veteran presences. Slayton is kind of to me more of a body out possession receiver who understands how to position his body against DBs, not necessarily going to run away from guys, but does a good job of doing that. It really has done it at all three levels of the field throughout his career. Mooney's much faster, shiftier, can work off the line as a motion guy. So I think those two complement each other well. And you had Malachi Fields in the third round. See what you get out of him. So potentially a good receiving group, but if Neighbors struggles to come back at full speed, then this is not going to be a group with a needle mover. They added Isaiah Likely as a pass catching tight end option. He's maybe a little bit better than Theo Johnson, who was in house last year and got thrown a bizarre number of isolation routes and like things where it's like we clearly want Theo one-on-one here. I'm not real sure why, because it's not like he's dominating on his routes. I think he's a fine player, but yeah, that just kind of surprised me as the season went on. It's like, I don't understand why this is your featured player. It should probably just go to whoever's open to the scheme rather than trying to really give Theo Johnson a chance to go make another contested catch. But whatever, I think could be a good player in the right role. And then you got Chris Manhertz as a good blocker. So interesting tight end room without maybe an elite player. And then the offensive line, we're gonna see how it rolls. I mean, Andrew Thomas is outstanding when he's out there and healthy. Hopefully, he can do those things this year. Jermaine Illuminor. I don't necessarily agree with Illuminor's hype of his own game, which he says he's the best tackle in the NFL, which I guess is a good thing to put out there when you're going into the free agency market. I'm not sure the $13 million a year contract that put him like 50th among linemen in general really matches up with that assessment. But hey, why quibble with numbers? And then the rest, in the other part, Illuminor threw out there is he thinks that this can be a top 10 offensive line. I guess if Francis Moyaga, the 10th overall pick out of Miami, who's going to start at right guard, I guess if he's just dominant at the point of attack, that could happen because Andrew Thomas is that good, and John Michael Schmitz, I'd say he's just more mediocre than anything. Still has a few reps where he gets blown up, but I'd say he's pretty solid player relative to where he started his career, and like somebody you don't feel bad about having as your center. And then you got John Runyon next to him at left guard, who's probably similar description, just very competent lineman at the guard spot, but not somebody who's going to overwhelm you. I think they really need Mwaga to be that field tilting player if you're actually going to be a top 10 offensive line. I think it's way more likely that this is just kind of an average group. So we'll see. I think you've got all the pieces in place to keep evaluating Jackson Dart, keep moving the offense along. I just worry again about the fact that Matt Nagy is going to be the guy putting it together because there's just no good track record. And, and I just love, these people who frame Matt Nagy or Eric Bieniemy as being like the offensive coordinator in Kansas City, as if that title means the same thing that it does elsewhere. Andy Reid is the offensive coordinator in Kansas City. Andy Reid is the play caller in Kansas City. The offensive coordinator job, therefore, is just like a senior research analyst role, right? Like that they're rolling game planning, and I don't know this from being in the building. I'm just saying from being in other buildings I've been in and seeing this dynamic. If the head coach runs the offense, then ultimately, the coordinator's probably running certain things in meetings during the week when the head coach has other responsibilities. That's less true in the NFL than it is in college, where you've got PR stuff. But like at the end of the day, the guy calling the plays and who has his thumb on it is gonna come in and be the ultimate decision maker in the room. And that's just not the same thing as if you're, say an offensive or defensive coordinator under a head coach who's a special teams guy. And I worked in a situation like this at Northwestern, where the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, it's not that, head coach didn't know what we were doing and might not chime in with ideas, but he let them run their rooms, right? Like there was no chance that, he's, so you're actually running the whole thing. That's not what's going on in Kansas City, right? So, like, just, it's just important to distinguish that. It's not to say that you can't go have success elsewhere. We've seen plenty of guys come off of Sean McVay's tree, and McVay's the offensive coordinator of his ship. So it's not, a dammer, but like, understand what the difference is, right? So we'll see how that goes. Flipping over to the defense, so they shipped Dexter Lawrence out of town, and watching the Giants film down the stretch, I think that's definitely a good trade for the Giants. Definitely a good trade for the Giants, and potentially like a huge win for them, because if Dexter Lawrence shows up and plays like he did last year for Cincinnati, that is a loss for the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, Dexter Lawrence, that was, just, forklifting offensive linemen across the league in the 2023 and 2024 seasons before his injury. That dude's worth the 10th overall pick. But at the same time, you're paying a veteran contract. This is a rebuilding team. So even if that happens for the Giants, I don't think it's, like the Giants really lose the trade. They still got the 10th overall pick, still added to the offensive line with Will Francis there. But yeah, I think that Cincinnati's the team carrying all the risk in that deal. So I think that's a fine move for them as they move into this new era. They backstopped it with veterans like DJ Reader, Shelby Harris. Those guys only have so much left in the tank at this point, but they should be able to hold their own. It's going to be so interesting to see what happens with Abdul Carter this year. As I mentioned earlier, man, is he quick to the edges, and he gets all these quick pressures. But it's interesting because he's not good at closing to the quarterback. I think you can just kind of say that definitively with the number of pressures he's getting, that he's not turning into sacks. And then he also can get completely overwhelmed at the point of attack in the run game and just get, if he is just, trying to, engage a lineman and hold you see him get completely pancaked in situations where, you should not be getting just blown up like that. It's not like you're in a disadvantageous situation. Like some of it's just like, So he obviously, I think, needs to be used in a pretty specific way. The tough thing is that Brian Burns on the other side, another really good pass rusher who does have the ability to close and get his sacks, is not the most stout of run defenders either. So, that pairing is pretty light, but they are so dynamic. I think you can work around it. Kayvon Thibodeau, I guess, will be in the mix as a rotational player at this point, which, I guess could have kind of seen that coming. All the editions of the Essential FL, did not love his rookie tape. Think he's come along as a player, but only brings so much. And it's what the other part that's going to be super interesting is seeing Arvell Reese line up next to Tremaine Edmonds. I'm guessing that Reese will be deployed as extra blitzer, stuff like that. But again, talking about influences, it's not like we're coming from the Vic Fangio tree where like Zach Bond's doing that role so effectively. So, that's not necessarily something that comes to mind as readily with Rob Saleh's defenses. Now there are parts of that. So don't want to over exaggerate it. And, pretty much everybody uses, show fronts on third down at some time or another, which is where a lot of this blitzing will come from for Arvell Reese. So, we'll see how it comes together. But yeah, just first year defensive coordinator and a lot of pieces that, need to be used creatively. I'm sorry, not a first year. Denard Wilson's the defensive coordinator. I'm sorry, got one team back, but yeah. So how Denard Wilson, rolls all this out, I think is going to be interesting. I never thought that Wilson did anything bad as the Titans' defensive coordinator. But it was just he was just in a tough spot. He didn't have any talent. They played hard, I think, but like outside of Jeffrey Simmons and Tamondre Sweat, like there just weren't players on that defense, so they weren't very good. So I don't think Denard Wilson did anything to disqualify himself. But I also, I think he was just probably a good coach in a bad situation, but maybe not a standout coach. So we'll see how that all works. But he's going to have many more pieces to be creative with. I apologize for talking about solid background and everything like that. I got obviously I was back one team there in terms of talking about the fit. My apologies. A lot of things flying here. But hopefully you're going to be really, really creative with how you use Arvell Reese, and then got Tremaine Edmonds, who never developed into a dominant player, but certainly brings a lot of length and some range at that inside linebacker spot. The back end I think is just solid more than anything. We got that pairing of Tyler Nubin and Javon Holland, I think is a solid pairing. Holland hasn't been the same field tilting player he was several years ago in the years since in terms of playmaking, but he's still a solid enough player out there. I think the corners are just fine. Drew Phillips is steady in the slot. Got Paulson Adebo on the outside here. Greg Newsome across from him is going to be a question mark. Did not play very well for Jacksonville. I don't think anybody would say. And signed a 1 year, $8 million deal. But they draft Colton Hood, top of the second round. And, we could for sure see him play his way into the starting lineup sooner than later. So, I think that just a team in transition, not a very good roster. They've been drafted near the top of the draft for some time now. That's not an accident. And we'll just see because, obviously Harbaugh did a really nice job in Baltimore. I thought that, multiple times where you saw him pull the right trigger. I mean, shoot, the Super Bowl run with Joe Flacco, he fired Cam Cameron as the offensive coordinator, brought in Jim Caldwell, and sparked the offense. And talk about knowing the right buttons to press. Like, we don't see coordinator changes like that in the NFL very often. So, and certainly don't see them spark Super Bowl runs very often. So Harbaugh I think has done a lot of good things in the NFL, runs the organization well, but this is certainly one of those things where, if they don't get the roster talent right here, it could turn, for all the hopes of competency, could turn into a Pete Carroll situation in Las Vegas where like the team's just not good enough. The offensive coordinator puts an offense that's kind of in flux in a really bad position, which is certainly something Matt Nagy could do. And then if that happens, I think all bets are off. So we'll see how it happens. I would be way more optimistic for this team if Todd Monken was coming in, because I would feel like it's a sure thing that the offense around Jackson that is schemed around Jackson Dart is a good fit for his strengths. I don't have that confidence with Matt Nagy. So hopefully for the Giants and fans, that all get proven wrong on all those counts, and this is a super fun offense to watch. But we'll see. Got time till September, and we won't figure out till then. So. All right. Last team to wrap up on today's State of the Teams, 26 New Orleans Saints. All right. So running through this roster, I mean, this is like, especially on offense, I feel like this team has like the most variance of, certainly any of the teams I've reviewed so far, and maybe any team in the league. So anyways, to start off, the New Orleans Saints entering 2026. And I know there's some dead cap money involved, but like, looking at these numbers with Mickey Loomis still in place as the general manager, it's like an out of body experience, is what I wrote in the article. I mean, they have 13 million in cap space this year. All these teams need to sign their draft classes, by the way, but whatever. 2027, they have $54 million in cap space, and that's not negative 54 in cap space. They're not like $100 million over the cap and need to re-sign 8 contracts next spring to get under. They actually have $54 million in cap space, and then they got $244 million in 2028. So certainly the NFL salary cap rising contributed to this. Derek Carr retiring, what he did kind of helped the process along. But you know what? The Saints have their books clear, and a chance to really build this roster. So yeah, just wild. And they have pretty much all their own picks moving forward. They've got all their picks in rounds 1 through 5, the next 2 drafts, and then they've got an extra 6 from the Chargers next year, and then they've got extra 6 from Houston and 7s from Dallas and New England a year after. So yeah, they haven't been gutting their draft classes to build this team. So it is pretty wild. And I think that when we look at where we are looking at the Saints going into last season, and even setting aside Tyler Shutt down the stretch, just the way the team played and competed under Kellen Moore, I think speaks really well to him as the head coach. And, definitely more steps to take it to the next level. But I think all that was really encouraging. And, there's just so many young, interesting players on this team. And yeah, I guess that good place to start, Tyler Shutt, right? Quarterback, always comes first with these long-term evaluations on the roster. But yeah, Tyler Shutt was a really interesting guy for me to watch. I was really struggled to find what I felt like was a really strong comparison, because he's a very effective runner, definitely has very good stride length and eats up grass well once he gets going. But he's tall, right? So there's not so many of those guys, and then typically they're a little bit more explosive, Shutt. Obviously he's got some good escapes on his tape, but at the same time, I wouldn't say this guy is in a phone booth quick, doesn't have great short area burst in the way that, we could name off many other quarterbacks who, Lamar Jackson comes to mind for sure, who are, just very, very quick and explosive in their movements. Even a Ryan Tannehill, who's kind of along similar profiles. I thought Tannehill was a thicker, more explosive player, right? And where that really shows up is in their throwing ability, because that's one other interesting thing about Tyler Shutt is that, for as effective as he is as a runner, normally if you've got some lower body traits, that translates itself into throwing the ball and you're an explosive thrower of the football. Again, Lamar Jackson's a great example of this, where even when there were questions about him as a passer, it's man, he can sure as hell spin it though. Even if he's, figuring out where he wants to spin it to, and that process can be off when he knows where he's going with it, man, that dude can roll it. Shutt does not have that type of arm. I'd say he's got an above average arm. He can make the throws you need to in the NFL, but the ball doesn't explode off his hands by any means. I'd say he's a much smoother thrower, right? So it's just interesting because that part of the game is more like a Matt Ryan to me, right? In terms of the arm strength and kind of the pacing of his throws and everything. But then he runs, in a way that Matt Ryan didn't. So interesting combination. He's his own guy, as these guys all are, but sometimes there's just a more ready comparison. And especially for a guy who's 6'5", 220, that's, out of central casting in terms of those numbers, right? So I just figured there'd be somebody who came more readily to mind. But, Shutt is a guy who grew on me. I think that there's certainly things to be cleaned up. Overall, I think his ball placement needs to be better. There's a lot of catches on tape that the receiver's reaching back for, showing off some good hands, making the catches more difficult or preventing run after catch opportunities. So Dak Prescott is a guy who, in my opinion, had a lot of that on his tape as a rookie, and then, tightened up the accuracy, and really made a difference in year 2 for him and for the rest of his career, frankly. So, Shutt can get that cleaned up. I think that you've got all the makings of a quarterback who could be above average. Not sure I really see him pushing the elite tier, just with the, just okay traits overall for an NFL quarterback. But, I thought that Shutt showed a good ability to process through the different concepts the Saints were running and to work, across the field and to different options. Heck, a lot of those balls that I would have liked to see better placement on are him coming off the front side concept, coming back to the dig route, and, maybe leaving the dig route a little too far in front, a little too far behind. Some cases, again, catchable ball, but not ideal. But that, does show he's kind of working through the offense, and, juxtaposing him with Jackson Dart. And of course, very different coaching situations as well, with just the chaos that was going on in New York around Dart. So, I don't want to write off or, put, or just ordain success for any of these guys, right? Just kind of where the assessment is at right now. I think show he can operate Kellen Moore's offense, and that offense around him could be quite a bit better this year. So all those, there is a lot of uncertainty with these guys though. So like Chris Olave as an example, had a wonderful season. So great to see him pretty healthy throughout the year, put up huge numbers. Be the guy that it was clear he could be on film from really when he hit the league as a rookie. And but at the same time, we're 1 year away from Olave dealing with all those concussion issues. So and likewise, eighth overall pick, Jordan Tyson, who they add to the wide receiver room and should be an awesome complement to Olave. Well, big knock on him in the draft cycle was all the injuries, right? So hey, we've got two potential really high-end weapons, and those guys would have a really nice complement to them. And Devon Bailey, who's a big-bodied receiver who does a good job in his role, but just doesn't have the explosive skill set to really be an elite receiver. And then you've got Jawan Johnson, who's a very good pass-catching tight end. Good athleticism, great hands, good size to it all, and then shoot. So that in terms of the key pass catchers, that should be a well-rounded group. But again, your two elite players, Olave, give it another year, and I think we can put the concussion stuff to bed. But I think at this point, still something to think about. And then Jordan Tyson has to prove himself in the league here. Rounding out that tight end position, they add Oscar Delp in the third round, which should help the run game quite a bit given his profile, and that'll be interesting because they add Travis Etienne, which got to get used to that one with him correcting us all on that pronouncement. But he's coming off one breakout year in Jacksonville, and this time last year, people were debating whether he'd even be in the rotation there with kind of what everything Jacksonville had going on. Of course, didn't work out that way. I thought Etienne played very well last year. He's explosive guy in space, so should be a good addition. And then Alvin Kamara, we're looking for him to bounce back to 2 years ago form and find one last little drink out of that fountain of youth. Obviously, Kamara was elite back in his time. Several years into his tenure in the NFL right now. I guess he's entering it. This will be his ninth season, 2017 draft pick. So tremendous career. Just needs to get the juice rolling, or probably doesn't have the juice to get rolling again. So hopefully, having Achane with him, you can use those guys in a platoon, and Kamara can be more effective with his touches this year. So, a lot of moving pieces, but man, that could be a really good group. And then up front, I think that, you add David Edwards. He's, of course, a free agent, so that's a bit of a question mark, but he's been really, really solid for the Buffalo Bills over these past couple of years. I wouldn't say he's an elite guard. Contract would concur with that, but I think he's a really good player for you, very steady. If Eric McCoy is healthy at center, that's a big if. He's only played 7 games each of the past 2 years, but McCoy was an elite center in my mind early in his career, and I think he still can be a plus center for you, even with the injuries piling up. So gives you 2 potentially very good players on that interior offensive line. Cesar Ruiz is, I think just kind of a guy out there. He's competent. He's played a lot of ball in his career, but I don't know, he's just not necessarily moving people in the run game, can kind of get knocked back at times. So he's just never really hit that first round pedigree ceiling. But, like if Cesar Ruiz is your 5th best offensive lineman with this group, which is a real possibility, I think that you're going to be okay. And, who knows, maybe Jeremiah Wright, the 4th round pick, outplays him at guard. And then, we'll see what happens with these tackles, but Kelvin Banks and Talisi Fuaga, I think you'd probably take the Jets tackle tandem of Olafashanu and Armand Membu if you're picking one from that has a first round pick from each of the last 2 classes. But I still think that there's a lot of meat left on the bone for Kelvin Banks and for Talisi Fuaga. Now, Banks I thought was pretty good overall throughout his rookie year. He's there are going to be some things to clean up as a rookie offensive lineman. So much to learn at that position. But I think Banks clearly has the size and length and movement ability to play left tackle in the NFL. We'll talk about the New England Patriots at some point here, but with Membu and Banks available, like that's like such a strange pick with Will Campbell because yeah, just got a guy who's big enough, right? But so I think Banks is on track to be a steady player. Fuaga, he slid over to right tackle. I've still got some questions with him, similar questions to what I have with him on the left side, where I think he's susceptible to getting beat inside with quickness. And just is kind of figuring out how to best navigate the position. But at the same time, I think the traits are still there to be, effective starter in the NFL. I think if it doesn't work at tackle, I mean, some of his issues would just be immediately solved by shifting him inside to guard. I think because like some of that quickness, dealing with a pass rusher in space. Well, if you're in tight confines, you're not really dealing with that as much. So we'll see. But I'm still optimistic on Fuaga, and I think you could have really good pairing there. So there's to me a scenario where you've got a top 10 offensive line, you got a top 10 skill position group. All these players are in flux. So it's, hinges on a lot. And, maybe the bottom falling out for the offensive line isn't as likely because there's less injury concerns, less 1 year player concerns with that. It's more just like the offensive tackles developing to push them into the top 10. The skill position group, I think, is like huge variance, but, that could easily be a top 5 group, in my opinion, if really everything hits. And maybe not easily a top 5, but easily a top 10 for sure. So, going to be exciting to see what they can put together. And I think that if all the pieces are there and the talent is there, Kellen Moore's going to put them in a good position, and Tyler Shuck can hopefully pull the trigger. So, all right, and then we'll get to the defense here. Hour 15. So yeah, long time to talk about 4 teams. Maybe speed these up in future, but hey, this is how I talk through all this stuff and make sure that I, have everything lined up and I'm not confusing coordinators by the time we get to the season here. So, anyways, looking at this defense, let's just talk Chase Young for a little bit. I thought he was outstanding down the stretch last year, and Chase Young's had a lot of good moments in the NFL, but man, kind of rewatching some of that film, it's like, man, this dude is. I feel like he's really found his groove as like understanding how to use his power and strength, which are just so outstanding, and how to use that to really attack offensive tackles. And I think he plays with a relentlessness throughout games that's really impressive. The effort level always feels high, and I think he's just really figured out how to work the angles, find shorter passes to the quarterback, all these different things. And then his performance against Jake Matthews in Week 18 was just straight up dominant. So he's really the cornerstone of this defense. He's certainly a plus pass rusher. And the stuff I was watching, I think that he's like, maybe he finds a little push here and kind of gets himself into that elite grouping, a couple of years later than we might have all expected. But to me, that looked like a guy whose game was coming together and like pushing new heights. As good a film as I've seen from Chase Young. So if you can't tell, I'm extremely excited to watch Chase Young play early next season. So much more so than I have been in recent years. So I guess that just speaks to what I saw in the film. Rounding out the group, you got Carl Granderson across from him, who has great length, plays with great effort. I think very good two-way player, more solid than, maybe a field tilter, but, really good guy to have in the group. Got a lot of size on that interior defensive line. Brian Brisset has his moments where, you definitely see why he was picked in the first round. Maybe, love to see that on a more consistent basis, more dominant basis, but darn good player. Devon Goodshaw, Nathan Shepard, really sturdy players on that interior. Add Christian Miller with the second round pick. He's clocking in at 6'4", weighing in at 6'4", 320. So just add into that beef on the inside, and then that should be good because you get a little bit more of an undersized feel at off-ball linebacker. Bringing in Caden Ellis to replace Demario Davis. Caden Ellis is a guy who, I think among blitzing linebackers, he's pretty rare in his ability. He can get engaged and disengaged with an offensive lineman with, hand combat techniques and such. Many linebackers who have success blitzing are relying on either getting matched up with the running back or just having clear blitz lanes to run through. Ellis is the dude or one of the dudes who can, if he has to engage an offensive lineman and beat him with a pass rush move, he actually has that in his bag. Not the best off the ball see it guy, I wouldn't say. So it'll be interesting to see the different flavor with him stepping in for Demario Davis, who, Davis is best. He was an unbelievable blitzer as well. But I would say, last couple of years, his best plays have been more readed out plays where he's getting to the right spots. So see what happens there. And then, Pete Warner is just an undersized player. He's listed at 240 on our lads. I would believe 230. He's 6'2". You just see him get completely overwhelmed at times, but he's got great speed. And so playing behind a bigger defensive line that should keep him cleaner. I think that Pete Werner can be a very, very good player for you in the right situation. So hopefully that comes together. And then, in Brandon Staley's defense here, the guys that, the guy who really surprised me with his tape down the stretch was Quincy Riley, who plays outside cornerback across from Kool-Aid McKinstry. A little bit better known player in McKinstry, who was a borderline first round prospect, went in the second. Quincy Riley, 2025 fourth round pick. Now, I don't know that either of these guys are ever going to be elite. I don't know that if you were to put them in a scheme where you asked them to play a lot of press man, if they really have the physical skill sets to do that at a high level. But as off coverage defenders who are playing in this Staley system, I think these guys do a really good job. I saw Quincy Riley targeted quite a bit on tape down the stretch in the season. And, again, I'm not saying that this dude's about to be Darrelle Revis for you, but I didn't feel like he was like a mark at all. I thought he was pretty competitive and competing for the ball and staying in phase and all of those things. So, he and Kool-Aid are good at, keeping the play in front of them, which this scheme asks them to do quite a bit. And, again, not like the twitchiest, most, explosive athletes at the corner position, I wouldn't say from the tape, but like just in terms of the way they play it, the way they keep things in front of them, the way they recognize routes and drive on balls, I think those guys do a good job for you. So I think those are clearly your starting outside corners. We've got a lot of moving parts at safety potentially. Justin Reed back as a veteran. Got Julian Blackmon, another veteran in the mix. Two younger guys. Jonas Sanker was a 2025 third round pick. Thought he really stood out at the beginning of the season as a playmaker. Didn't see that as much down the stretch. Jordan Howden, though, a 2023 fifth rounder. I thought, there were a couple games down the stretch where don't necessarily see him as the full-time guy, but as a sub defender playing down in the box, I think that he's got some good instincts down there in terms of knowing where to go, and then he's physical when he gets there. So Jordan Howden had a good handful of reps that I really liked down the stretch. So see what his role is, and then it's and then add Lorenzo Styles Jr. in the fifth round. So not as highly drafted as I believe his brother Sonny Styles. Hopefully don't have that off there, but definitely a name that stuck out in the draft process when you got two brothers and one is that highly regarded. So I think that they've got a lot to work with the Saints. Could definitely stand to add another great edge rusher. True standout player at safety, but can't have everything. And I think that they've done a really nice job building this roster out. And I certainly don't think that they're about to make a run for the Super Bowl, but in terms of looking at their odds to win the NFC South, they're second behind the Bucs, who I think are kind of working on a lot of stored up equity rather than maybe next year's projection. We'll get to them at some point, but I think that they're a good value. I would not surprise me at all to see them win this division this year. I think that is very much in the cards for them. And, if everything goes right, it looks like they're building out just a really, really good roster. And it'll be interesting to see how much the quarterback can elevate them. So, all right. Well, hey, we'll call it there. Hour and 20 on 4 teams. So I guess if you got the time during the off season, right? Anyways, certainly enjoyed myself, if you can't tell. And fun to talk through all these teams, run through all the details again after writing up the notes during the week. And we'll continue to drill into this as the off season goes on and we try to get this all lined up. But hey, anybody listen, thanks so much for taking the time. Obviously, hey, subscribe, like, do all those things. That's great. But hey, I'll be here regardless, one way or the other, and enjoying myself. And hey, if you want to support the show in any other way, you can always write fiction as well. So I got a novel, The Bubble Society, that's up on Amazon. Get the electronic version. That's a huge win. For me, or I don't know about huge win, but hey, nice little thing that you can do to keep my projects moving along. So, but yeah, so glad I got the day job to pay the bills, and keep having fun doing stuff like this. So thanks so much for listening to the Essential NFL Podcast, everyone. And if you want to review kind of what I was talking about with these teams, use my articles as my notes as I talk. But you can always check out those articles on the Essential NFL Substack, and I'll be hitting the next 4 teams in the week to come with the Kansas City Chiefs up next on my list. So anyways, have a great day, everyone.